My name is Grace Stone. I was 31 years old the day my father stood up in a rented hall in front of every single person in our family, raised a glass of champagne, smiled the smile of a man who believes he is being generous, and handed my younger brother Ryder a cheque for $1 million to start his own business. The room exploded. People stood up from their chairs. My aunts grabbed each other's arms. The men from the lumberyard who had come straight from their shifts were clapping with sawdust still on their sleeves. My mother pressed both hands to her chest and cried the kind of tears you only cry when something has gone exactly the way you always believed it would. Ryder took that cheque the way he took everything in his life, like it had been sitting in a drawer, with his name on it since the day he was born, and he grinned and kissed my mother's cheek and said something about disruption and vision and the future, and people laughed in all the right places, because Ryder had always known exactly where the right places were. Then my father turned to me. I was standing near the dessert table because I had not been told to stand anywhere in particular. He found me there, and he looked at me the way you look at something you have already decided the value of, and he spoke quietly, almost gently, the way a man speaks when he genuinely believes he is being kind. Go earn your own. 7 words. No anger, no cruelty, no raised voice. Just a closing door delivered in a pleasant tone. And the room, all of these people who had watched me keep the family's books since I was 19 years old, who had eaten dinners I had helped pay for and driven trucks whose repairs I had quietly covered. The room just nodded. Like a daughter being told to go figure it out while her brother collected $1 million was simply how things were supposed to work. My mother smiled into her wine. My aunts touched my arm and told me how proud they were of Ryder. And at the very far end of that long table, my grandfather Walter Stone, 81 years old, the man who had built the entire lumber business from one flatbed truck and a bad knee in 1968, sat completely still with his hands folded in his lap. He did not clap. He did not nod. He just looked at me, steady and quiet, across the whole length of the room. I noticed. I think he wanted me to notice. What I did not understand yet was that in that exact moment, while my father was handing Ryder the future and handing me a sentence, my grandfather had already made a decision of his own, and he had been building something quietly for months, something made of nothing but paper and patience, and the particular kind of love that does not announce itself until it is completely finished. And what he had built was going to make my father stand up in a lawyer's office one year, later, and scream like a man watching everything. He thought he owned disappear through a door he never knew was locked. Before I take you into what happened next, you need to understand exactly who I was the night of that announcement, because that is the version of me my father was counting on. And it is the version I had quietly, privately, already decided to leave behind forever. I had been the invisible engine of my family since I was 19 years old. That was the year our family bookkeeper quit without any notice, and nobody else in the Stone family could read a ledger well enough to keep the business from drifting. So the job simply fell to me, because I was there and I was capable, and in my family those two things were always enough reason to hand someone more work without a thank you. The first year I kept those books, I caught a vendor double billing us $8,000. I fixed it quietly, filed the paperwork, closed the gap and moved on. Nobody said thank you. They just handed me more responsibility the following quarter, and the quarter after that, and every quarter after that for the next 12 years. By the time I was 25, I had passed my CPA exams and taken a position at a small accounting firm 2 towns over, and my family knew my title the way you know the name of a piece of furniture. Present. Useful, occasionally mentioned, never truly considered. My mother had a way of summing up my place in the family that she had been using for years. Always said kindly, always said casually, the way she said most of the worst things without ever seeming to notice what they were. She had said it first when I was maybe 23, at a dinner where the conversation kept circling back to Ryder's latest idea, and she had reached over and patted my hand and said it like she was giving me something comforting. Ryder carries the name. You just have it. I had nodded. I had even thanked her, which is the part that embarrasses me most now. I had thought for years that this was simply wisdom, that some people were built to carry things forward, and some people were built to hold things steady, and that holding steady was its own kind of dignity. The night of the announcement, driving home across town alone in the dark, I finally heard those words for exactly what they had always been. I did not cry. I want to be completely honest about that, because people expect tears at this moment in the story, and I understand why. But I have never been a person who cries when I am hurt. I am a person who opens a notebook. So I made coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, opened a fresh notebook to the very first page, and at the top I wrote the only thing I was completely certain of at that moment. One word: start. I did not know yet what I was starting. I only knew I was done waiting to be chosen by people who had already made up their minds about my value. I was done being the person who showed up quietly and fixed things and never asked for credit. I was done holding the name and letting someone else carry it. Whatever came next was going to have my signature on it. That was the only thing I knew for certain, and that night, it was enough. The next morning I drove out Route 9 to the lumberyard, telling myself I was going to drop off the quarterly numbers, which was a convenient lie I allowed myself to keep for about 40 minutes. The truth was I needed to see my grandfather. Walter Stone was already at the yard when I pulled into the gravel lot. Because Walter was always already at the yard, had been for more than 50 years, arriving before the first delivery truck, leaving after the last receipt was filed. His chipped blue enamel coffee mug sat on the wooden counter, where it had sat every single morning since before I was born, in the same spot, wearing the same ring stain on the same piece of wood. He poured me a coffee without asking, and slid it across the counter and said nothing, which was how Walter started every important conversation. With silence, giving you room to fill it with whatever was actually true. I told him everything. The hall, the check, my father's words, the room full of people nodding like it made sense. I told him plainly, without drama, the way you tell a person who you know will not try to make you feel better before they try to understand. I expected comfort. Maybe a quiet word about how my father had always been this way, maybe a gentle apology on behalf of the family. Walter did neither of those things. He let me finish talking. He looked at me over that old blue mug for a long, steady moment, and then he asked me the one question I had not expected anyone to ask. So what's the plan? Not are you okay? Not that's not fair. Not your father means well. Just, what is the plan? And I started to say I didn't have one yet, and then I stopped mid-sentence because I did have one. I had written it down the night before. It was one word, but it had a shape underneath it, and when Walter asked the question, the shape became clearer. I talked it through out loud for the first time, this half-formed idea of doing for small struggling businesses what I had always done for free for my own family. Clean books. Honest numbers. Real plans. A way out of the hole for people who were good at their work, but terrible at their finances. Walter listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he did that almost nobody else in my life had ever learned to do. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said the line I would carry with me through everything that followed, said it simply, the way he said everything that mattered. I'm not betting on the loud one. I'm betting on the one who shows up. He told me to come back the next morning. He said he wanted to show me the old books, the original ledgers from 1968, the ones he had kept by hand in the years when the business was young and fragile, and nobody was certain it would survive. I said I would be there. I drove home thinking about what he had said. I did not yet understand that while he was asking me about plans and showing me old books and listening to me talk through half-formed ideas, he was also doing something of his own, quietly, carefully, with the precision of a man who has kept meticulous records his entire life and knows exactly what a properly signed document can withstand. You have to understand what Stone Lumber and Supply meant to the town of Brindle before I can tell you what I found in that filing cabinet, because without that context, the rest of the story is just a family argument about money, and it was never just that. My grandfather started Stone Lumber in 1968 with one flatbed truck, a bad knee from a construction accident 2 years earlier, and enough stubbornness to make up for everything else he was missing. By the time I was born, it was the place where every contractor in a 30-mile radius ordered their wood, where every weekend carpenter came for advice they did not know they needed, where every widow fixing her porch got a fair price and someone who would explain exactly what she was buying. It had put roofs over half the houses in Brindle and floors under half its businesses, and it had done that steadily, honestly, for 50 years, because Walter Stone ran it the way he ran everything, by showing up every morning and keeping clean books and never spending money he did not actually have. My father Gerald had run the business for 15 years, and he ran it competently, but he had never built it. He had inherited it. And I think that gap lived inside him, the way a splinter lives under skin. Invisible from the outside, but always there, always irritating, always reminding him of the difference between what he was and what he wanted people to believe he was. To prove to himself and to everyone watching that he was a builder and not just an heir, he had taken out a significant loan to build a second warehouse on the edge of town. He talked about it at every family dinner, like it was a monument he was raising. He had also, as I discovered while sorting through old files for Walter one afternoon, done something else that no one was supposed to know about yet. One afternoon at the yard, digging through a filing cabinet that had not been properly organised in years, I came across the loan paperwork for the new warehouse. I read it the way I read everything, slowly, all the way through, twice. My father had not simply borrowed against the business. He had borrowed against what he expected to inherit from Walter someday. He had written a cheque against a promise that existed only in his own assumptions, spending money he did not have yet on an inheritance that had not been offered, signed, or guaranteed by anyone. I did not say a word to anyone. I filed the paperwork back exactly where I had found it, closed the cabinet drawer, and kept the information in my head where it sat quietly for months, the way important information always does when you are a person who understands that the right moment to use what you know is not always the moment you learn it. My first real client found me not through advertising or a referral system or any kind of deliberate effort. He found me through the particular small town mechanism of one person telling another, person that someone they knew was quietly good at something. His name was Tom Vasquez, and he ran a one-man repair shop off Main Street, the kind of place that fixes lawnmowers in the morning and listens to people's problems in the afternoon and charges fair prices for both. Tom was drowning. He owed money to 3 different vendors who were losing patience. His financial records were a literal shoebox filled with receipts in no particular order. The bank had stopped returning his calls 2 months earlier. A mutual friend had mentioned in passing that the Stone girl, not Ryder Stone, the other one, the quiet one, was apparently good with numbers. And Tom had called me on a Tuesday afternoon, embarrassed before the call even started, fully expecting to be talked down to, or told his situation was too far gone to fix. I want to be very clear about something here, because this is the point in the story where people often expect a wealthy family member to appear and provide resources that change everything. There was no wealthy family member. There was no trust fund, no loan from a relative, no safety net of any kind. There was just me and a notebook, and 15 years of understanding exactly how money moves through a small business when it is managed well and when it is not. So I did the only thing I actually had to offer. I sat down with Tom's shoebox, and I went through every single number in it. I found the pattern in what he owed, and restructured his payment schedule into something survivable. I found him a small line of credit at a local credit union that still made decisions based on character and handshakes rather than just algorithms. I renegotiated 2 of his vendor contracts down to amounts a real human being could actually pay without choosing between the business and the electricity bill. I charged him a modest and fair fee, wrote up a proper signed agreement so that we both knew exactly where we stood and what we had agreed to, and I gave the whole thing a name that night when I got home. I wrote it across the top of a new folder in my neat accountant's handwriting. Stone Ventures. It was not a fund yet. It was not anything yet except a name and a private promise to keep doing this, to keep showing up with a notebook for people who were good at their work, but needed someone to make the numbers make sense. 2 weeks after I finished with Tom's books, he sent me 2 more men from his block. They arrived embarrassed, the way Tom had arrived. They left with a plan, the way Tom had left. And for the first time since I had sat at my kitchen table and written that single word in a fresh notebook, the thing I was building had the faint, unmistakable shape of something real. While I was rebuilding Tom Vasquez's shoebox one careful number at a time, my brother Ryder was showing everyone what $1 million looked like when you spent it on the idea of success rather than the substance of it. He leased an office space with exposed brick walls and a full glass front, the kind of space that cost more to look successful in than to actually become successful in. And he filled it with a logo a friend had designed, a social media presence another friend was running, and a third friend whose actual function nobody could clearly explain, even when asked directly. The launch party had an open bar, a DJ, and catering from a restaurant I recognised as significantly above the budget of a company that had not yet earned its first dollar. My parents came. My mother wore a new dress and introduced herself to everyone as the mother of an entrepreneur. My father stood by the glass wall with his arms crossed and his chest out, proud the way men are proud of things they have paid for. I went because not going would have been a statement, and I was not ready to make statements yet. I was still at the stage where I needed to be invisible and useful and patient, and showing up to my brother's party was part of keeping that particular disguise intact. I stood near the back and watched the money move in the wrong direction, and kept my expression completely neutral, which 15 years of client-facing work had made second nature. At one point, a man Ryder was trying to court as an investor drifted away from the main group and ended up near me, having mistaken me for some kind of event staff, and he asked me a real question about profit margins in the sector Ryder was supposedly targeting. I answered him plainly and completely, because I cannot help answering real questions plainly and completely. It is simply not in my nature to do otherwise. He asked another question, then another. We stood there for 10 minutes talking actual numbers, while the party continued around us. And I watched Ryder notice from across the room, watched his smile tighten by several degrees, watched him understand that the investor was listening to me in a way he was not listening to Ryder, and watched him decide that he did not like it. The investor shook my hand on his way out instead of Ryder's. I drove home from that party knowing 2 things with certainty. First, that Ryder's million was already moving in a direction that had nothing to do with building anything. And second, that the tightening of my brother's smile when someone listened to me was going to become relevant again before this story was finished. The whispers started about a month after the launch party. They were soft, which is always how the most damaging ones begin, never loud enough to confront directly, always just audible enough to shape how people think before they have had a chance to think for themselves. The story going around the family, I learned through the particular small-town information network that connects everyone who shops at the same grocery store and sits in the same church pews, was that Grace was bitter, that I was jealous of my brother's success, that I had started my little business operation purely out of spite, as a way of embarrassing the family and making Ryder look bad by comparison. I knew exactly where the story had originated. Ryder had always been gifted at narrative, at finding the version of events that cast him as the protagonist and everyone who questioned him as a supporting villain. The story he was telling now was about a sister who simply could not be happy for him, and it was a story that people found easy to believe because it was simpler than the truth, and because people in families almost always believe the loudest version of events first. My mother called me. She did not ask how my work was going. She did not ask about my clients or my plans, or whether I was eating properly or sleeping enough. She asked me, please, to not make things awkward at the next family dinner. Don't embarrass us, she said, as if I were the embarrassment in a family that had handed a grown man $1 million and told his sister to figure it out for herself. I did not fight it. I want to underline this because fighting it was the precise trap they had set, maybe not consciously, but effectively. If I argued, I became the bitter daughter they had already decided I was. If I defended myself, I was proving the narrative. So I stayed completely quiet, kept working, and let the only argument I trusted make itself in the only language that cannot be talked over or reframed or dismissed, the language of actual results. One of my aunts had believed Ryder's version of events enthusiastically at first. Then her bakery's books fell apart in the 3rd quarter, and she called me half hoping I would say no, so she could keep believing what she had been saying about me. I did not say no. I fixed her quarter. I found her $4,000 she had been losing monthly to a payment processor with a bad contract, and I never once mentioned a single thing she had said about me, because bringing it up would have made the help about the argument instead of about her bakery, and her bakery needed to matter more than my feelings. She did the math on her own. At the next family gathering, she sat beside me without anyone asking her to. By the time autumn came, Stone Ventures had 8 clients, then 10, then more arriving through the quiet word-of-mouth network of small business owners who talked to each other across back fences and at the hardware store and over coffee on Tuesday mornings. The name my father had tried to forbid me from using, he had summoned me to his study one Sunday and told me the Stone name belonged to the family business, and I had no right to attach it to my little operation, was bringing me clients he had never imagined, because people in Brindle associated the name Stone with exactly what my grandfather had built it to mean: honest work, fair dealing, and books you could trust. My father had wanted to protect the name. What he had not understood was that I was protecting it better than anyone had in years. And then my brother called me on a Thursday afternoon in October, and for the first time in our entire lives, the call was because he needed something I had. The exposed brick office was costing him $4,000 a month in rent, and had been for 6 months. 2 of his 3 friends had quietly stopped showing up. The investor who had shaken my hand at the launch party had formally passed on his pitch 2 weeks earlier. The social media presence had 300 followers and no revenue. And the account into which my father had deposited $1 million 12 months ago was running, low enough that Ryder could now see the bottom of it clearly, and it frightened him in a way that nothing had ever frightened him before, because Ryder had never in his life stood at the bottom of something and had to think about how to climb. He asked me to look at his books. He asked it as though he were granting me a privilege, which I will give him credit for. Even when Ryder needed you, he maintained a certain performance of not needing you. I went because I owed myself that much, to see it with my own eyes rather than through the fog of rumour and assumption. The numbers were worse than anything I had heard through the family grapevine. Of the $1 million my father had placed in Ryder's hands, roughly $250,000 remained, and it was draining steadily every week with nothing coming in to replace it. He had built nothing that earned money. He had built a stage, and he had performed on it beautifully, and the audience had been my parents and their friends, and a handful of people who liked the Instagram posts, and none of them had paid admission. I told him the truth, plainly, the way I always tell the truth. Here is where the money went. Here is what cutting costs now can realistically save. Here is what honest recovery looks like from this position. And then he asked the real question, the one he had actually called to ask. He wanted me to put Stone Ventures money into his company. He wanted to be my investment, my project, his sister's path to legitimacy. I looked at my brother, who had started with $1 million and a stage, and was now sitting across from the sister who had started with a notebook and a shoebox, and I said no. Not cruelly, just clearly. I do not pour clean money into a story. He did not tell our parents he had asked. I let him keep that. It was not my secret to spend. My grandfather began to slow that same autumn. It was small things at first, arriving at the yard a little later in the mornings, leaving a little earlier in the afternoons, occasionally losing the thread of a sentence and finding it again with a small patient frown, as though the word had simply stepped out for a moment and would return if he waited politely. I noticed but told myself stories about it. He was 81. He was tired. Old men slowed down, and that was not the same thing as running out of time. I kept visiting the yard with folders of quarterly summaries, even on the evenings when I did not strictly need to. Because the yard was where Walter was, and Walter was the one person in my life who had never needed me to be smaller than I was. He had been asking me for months to write down the full structure of how Stone Ventures worked, how I found clients, how I structured the deals, who held the risk, who held the paper, what happened when something went wrong. I had written him a clean 1-page summary and thought nothing more of it. Then one grey November afternoon, I arrived at the yard and found him sitting in the office with the lights off, his blue mug cold in his hands, and he waved me into the other chair and he talked about how he had started the business 50 years ago, which I had heard many times, but this time he told it differently. He told me about the year he had almost lost everything, about the men who had carried him through it, about the thing that scared him most, which was not failure. He had made his peace with the possibility of failure long ago, but watching what an easy inheritance did to a person. Money you did not earn, he said, can rot a man from the inside. I watched it happen. He did not say my father's name. He did not need to. Then he said something that did not quite fit the moment, said it almost offhandedly, while looking at the rain on the tin roof. I've been getting my papers in order. I asked him what papers. He smiled the way he smiled when he knew something I did not yet know, and changed the subject to the weather coming in off the ridge. I drove home that night with an unease I could not quite name, and I told myself comfortable things, and I let an 81-year-old man keep his secrets because I loved him and because I had clients waiting and because to truly hear what he was telling me I would have had to admit something I was not ready to admit. That was the last evening I had with him, that felt entirely ordinary. The last good conversation where I thought we had more time. Looking back now, I think he was already saying goodbye in the only way he knew how. Not with sentiment, but with information. A week before everything changed, Walter called me out to the yard and said it was a business matter. I assumed he wanted to go over some figures. When I arrived, Tom Vasquez was already standing by the counter with his hat in his hands, wearing the expression of a man who has been asked to be present for something important and is taking that responsibility seriously. Walter had the blue mug in one hand and a single sheet of paper in the other. He set the paper on the counter between us, in the smell of cut pine and machine oil and cold morning air, and he told me to read it. It was a term sheet. One page, simple and plain, the way Walter liked all important things. No unnecessary language, no flourishes, nothing that could be misread or argued over later. Walter Stone wished to invest $40,000 in Stone Ventures. Real terms. A specified return. A signature line at the bottom with space for 3 names. I looked up from the paper, and for once in my adult life I had nothing immediate or useful to say. He had been the first person in my family to believe that what I was building was real. Now he wanted to be the first person to put that belief in writing, with money attached and a witness present, because he understood, the way he understood everything about how lasting things are built, that belief only counts when it is documented. "Why Tom?" I asked. He looked at Tom steadily and said it simply. "Because a thing this important should have a witness." We signed. Walter's hand moved more slowly than it once had, but it was completely steady on the line. Deliberate, certain, the hand of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and why. Tom signed beneath us both. Walter kept his copy and slid mine across the counter. And then he said the line he had been saying to me all year. The one I had been carrying like a stone in my pocket through every hard week and every difficult night. But this time, he added an ending to it that changed the weight of everything that came before. "I'm not betting on the loud one. I'm betting on the one who shows up. Now it's in writing." I folded that single page and put it in my bag against my chest. Then, 2 weeks later, on what Walter had told me was his last good bright day, he walked me around the yard one more time and named the lumber the way other men name horses, with affection and specificity and the quiet pride of someone who built the thing they love from nothing. At the end of the walk, he took me into the office and pressed a key into my hand and closed my fingers around it. "When the rain comes through that roof," he said, "somebody who keeps good books should be the one to fix it." I laughed and said I was not a roofer. He did not laugh. He looked at me steadily and said it again, slower, the way he said things when he needed them to land underneath the words rather than on top of them. I understood he was not talking about the roof. I just did not let myself understand fully how much he was telling me, because to understand it completely, I would have had to admit that we were running out of clear days. So I put the key on my ring between my apartment key and my car key, an ordinary key among ordinary keys, and I told him I would come back Sunday. We stood a while in the cold sunlight. His blue mug sat on the counter where it always sat. He told me he was proud of me, which he had shown me 100 ways over the years, but said out loud perhaps twice in my entire life. I drove home that evening lighter than I had been in a year, the key cold against the others in my pocket, already planning what I would bring him Sunday. Sunday never came the way I planned it. Walter Stone died in his sleep on a Saturday night after a short illness that came quickly enough to be a mercy and slowly enough to allow goodbyes. The entire town came to the service. He had put roofs over half of Brindle's houses and floors under half of its businesses, and the people of that town had long memories for men who dealt with them honestly. I stood at the front of the room for 3 hours and shook every hand and accepted every casserole dish and every card and every memory people brought to share. Because that is what I do. I carry things, and I carry them without showing the weight, and people read that as composure or coldness, depending on what they need to believe about me. I made all the arrangements. My father was too proud and too shaken to organise anything, and my mother was too undone, and so I did it the way I do everything, methodically, completely, without being asked twice. I wrote the obituary. I chose the hymns. I coordinated the reception, and the catering and the flowers and the parking. I did it all with dry eyes because my grief comes late and alone and never in public, never on schedule, never in a way that other people find legible. The only moment I allowed myself was at the yard, alone, the night after the funeral. I drove out Route 9. and let myself in with the key he had given me, and stood in the dark office in the smell of sawdust that had been there since before I was born. His blue mug sat on the counter exactly where it always sat. I washed it carefully, dried it completely, and set it back in exactly its place. Then I let out one full year of held breath in the dark, alone where no one could see it and no one could call it weakness. What I did not see, because I was buried in logistics and arrangements and the 10,000 practical things that death requires of the living, my father saw with complete clarity. Even in the receiving line between handshakes, I caught him pulling our family attorney aside and asking in a low voice how soon the will could be read. His own father was 3 days in the ground, and he was already asking about the timeline. I filed that observation away alongside everything else I had been quietly filing for the past year. Grief and arithmetic, running side by side in the same man, neither one slowing the other down. The reading was scheduled for 2 weeks later at the office of an attorney named Marion Holt, whom I had never met, but whose name I had heard mentioned once or twice in connection with Walter's affairs. My father walked into that conference room with the particular confidence of a man who believes he already knows the ending. He was the only son. He had run the business for 15 years. The holdings would pass to him clean and whole. The bank would be satisfied. His tower would hold. And the embarrassing year in which his daughter had been building something in the background could be quietly folded back into its proper place in the family story, where daughters were useful and sons were important. In the days before the reading, he had been almost cheerful, which was its own kind of information. He had even found occasion to needle me when we crossed paths at the family house, where I had gone to drop off the last of the funeral paperwork. He looked at me with something that was almost pity, and said it again. The same sentence, the same tone, the same absolute confidence as a year before. After this is settled, maybe you'll stop playing business and go earn your own somewhere else. I told him I would see him at the reading. Marion Holt's conference room was small and warm and quiet, in the way that rooms are quiet when something significant is about to happen in them. My father took the head of the table without asking, the way he always occupied whatever space he entered. My mother sat to his right. Ryder slouched to his left with his phone face down on the table, performing indifference. Aunts and a great-uncle filled the remaining chairs, there to witness whatever was about to be distributed. I took a seat near the window where I could see the sky going grey outside and the first faint suggestion of rain on the glass. Marion came in with a leather folder and a manner that gave away absolutely nothing. She thanked everyone for coming, offered condolences in a voice that had delivered them 1,000 times and still meant them, opened the folder and said the first thing that rearranged the room before she had finished the sentence. Walter Stone, she explained, had not left a simple will. Years earlier, working with her office, he had placed the bulk of his assets into a revocable living trust. Upon his death, that trust had become irrevocable, and his estate would now pass according to its terms, outside of probate, privately, exactly as he had arranged, with no court involvement and no public process. My father's brow came together. This was not the document he had been picturing. A will was something you could read in advance, anticipate, challenge if necessary. A trust built years ago by a competent man with a careful attorney was a locked door he had not known existed. Marion worked through the smaller items in the trust first, unhurried, the way you would dismantle something complicated, carefully, in the right order. Walter's woodworking tools went to 2 old yardmen he had named specifically, men who had worked beside him for decades, and whose names the rest of the family did not immediately recognise. A college fund had been established for the youngest grandchildren, modest and clean. A generous sum had been set aside for my mother, with no conditions attached, which made her cry unexpectedly in a way I had not anticipated and did not entirely know how to watch. Then Ryder's bequest. Walter had left him the original flatbed truck, the first truck, the one from 1968, the one he had started everything with, and $10,000. I watched my brother's face work through the numbers in real time. He had walked into that room carrying the private belief that his grandfather's estate would refill the account he had drained, that the family money would circle back around and save him from the consequences of how he had spent the money the first time. Instead, he received a 30-year-old truck and a sum that would cover perhaps 2 months of his current expenses. He set his phone face down on the table. For the first time I could remember, Ryder Stone had nothing to perform. My father was still, completely still, in the way a person is still when they are saving all of their energy for what they are certain is coming next. The line about the business, the controlling stake in Stone Lumber and Supply, the inheritance that his entire financial structure had been built on top of like a foundation poured before the soil was tested. Marion reached it, and before she said who received it, she read the condition Walter had attached to its transfer. And the room went so quiet that I could hear the rain that had started outside, tapping the window the way rain had always tapped the tin roof at the yard. The controlling interest, she said, was to pass to the heir who had, during Walter Stone's lifetime, built a business or fund of their own, and had that business or fund documented in writing, with real consideration and a witness. She let the sentence finish, and then she let the silence do the rest. Every person in that room ran the same calculation and arrived at the same answer, one by one, and I watched it land on each face differently. Confusion on some, recognition on others, and on my father's face, something I had never seen there before in my entire life. Fear. Marion reached into her leather folder and drew out an envelope, and written on the front in handwriting I would have recognised in the dark was my name. The letters unsteady, a little cramped but unmistakably Walter's. She slid it down the full length of the conference table toward me. It travelled past my father, past my mother, past Ryder, past aunts and a great-uncle, and every eye in that room followed it, the way eyes follow the last important thing in a room when everything else has been decided. My father found his voice before the envelope reached me. He said it was absurd. He said his daughter had kept books once, and that did not make her anything. He said Walter had been confused, that old men get confused, that someone had clearly been in his ear for months putting ideas into a mind that was no longer reliable. His voice climbed as he spoke, filling the small conference room, filling the hallway outside it, until an assistant cracked the door to check whether something needed to be done. Marion raised one hand, not unkindly, but with the quiet, unmovable authority that attorneys in their own conference rooms have over even very angry men, and he stopped. She said, "The trust had been established years before Walter's death. While he was plainly and documentably competent, reviewed and witnessed and updated at multiple points, built by a man who had kept meticulous records his entire life and had worked with her office long enough for her to know the difference between careful planning and confusion. Contesting it, she said evenly, would be difficult and expensive, and in her experience these arrangements tend to hold when they are built this carefully." She did not promise him he had no case. Good attorneys never promise the weather. She simply made it clear that he would be spending money he did not have on a door that was almost certainly already locked. The envelope was in front of me. I put my hand on it and felt the entire year press up through the paper, the rented hall, the notebook, the shoebox, Tom Vasquez standing with his hat in his hands, the blue mug, the rain on the tin roof, the slow, steady scratch of an old man's pen on a single page in the smell of cut pine. I slid my thumb under the flap. Inside were two things. The first was a page of trust documentation confirming, in legal language, what Marion had already begun to describe. The controlling interest in Stone Lumber and Supply was transferring to me as the heir who had built and documented a business during Walter's lifetime, and the specific document named as proof of that condition was a one-page term sheet, dated the previous spring, signed by Walter Stone, Grace Stone and one witness. The $40,000 had not simply been a bet on me. It had been the key, cut months in advance, cut while Walter was still sharp and deliberate and completely certain of what he was doing, to a door he had known I would one day need to walk through. The second thing in the envelope was a letter. Short, one page, Walter's handwriting getting looser toward the bottom the way it always did when he was tired. He said he was sorry he was not there to see my face when I read it. He said he had watched a man stand up in a rented hall and hand $1 million to the loud child and a sentence to the steady one. And he had decided that day, that exact day, watching my face while the room applauded, to do something about it, in the only way he had ever trusted, with paper and patience and a properly signed document that could not be argued away. He said, "I'm not betting on the loud one. I bet on the one who showed up. You earned your name long before anyone gave you a dime. It was always yours, Gracie." I just made it official. I put the letter down on the table. 2 tears came. Not more than 2, because I was still in a room full of people, and I have never been able to give my grief to an audience. But 2 came and I let them, because he had earned them and so had I. Then I looked up and across the table. My father was already on his feet. My father came apart in that conference room in front of every person he had spent his entire life performing for. And I want to be honest about what that looked like, because a softer version of this story would skip it, or soften it, and I think you deserve the true picture. He said it was a mistake. He said his father had been manipulated. He said I had cornered a dying old man and extracted a signature from someone who no longer knew what he was signing. His voice climbed and then climbed further, the way a voice does when the argument it is making is losing its own logic, and the person making it knows it but cannot stop. The assistant cracked the door again. My mother put her hand on his sleeve and he shook it off. Marian let him exhaust the worst of it before she spoke again, calmly, in the same level tone she had used all morning, and when she repeated the facts, the age of the trust, the documentation, the careful construction of it, the timeline that placed every signature months before Walter was anything but fully competent, the screaming became quieter and then became something worse than screaming. It became the silence of a man recalculating a life, because my father was not simply losing an argument. He was losing the foundation that every financial decision he had made in the past 3 years had been built on top of. The warehouse loan, the $1 million he had given Ryder, the inheritance he had borrowed against before it existed. All of it had been constructed on the assumption that this room would go a different way. And the longer he stood there, the clearer it became that the tower he had built was standing on a promise that nobody had ever actually made to him in writing. I stood up. Not dramatically, not to shout him down. I have never won anything by being the loudest person in a room, and I was not about to start in my grandfather's name. I waited until my father had run out of breath and was standing there in the quiet. And then I reached into my bag and set the term sheet on the table where everyone could read it. 3 signatures. A clear date from months before, Walter's hand slow but absolutely steady on the line. If anyone wants to say my grandfather didn't know what he was doing, I said, here is his hand. Steady last spring. Read it. Nobody moved to read it. They did not need to. They could see it from where they sat, and they could see my father seeing it. Then I looked at him, the man who had told me in a rented hall in front of everyone we knew to go earn my own, and I kept my voice as level as Marian's had been all morning. You told me to go earn my own, I said. So I did. This is what my own looks like. I did not gloat. I did not list a single one of his sins. I told the room what would happen next, because someone had to say it clearly, and everyone else in that room was either too stunned or too implicated to speak. Stone lumber would stay open. Payroll would be made every Friday. The men in the yard would keep their jobs, because putting them out of work would dishonour the man who had given all of them a start. I would sit down with the bank and lay the books bare and restructure my father's loan into something honest and survivable, because putting him on the street would cost the town and cost my grandfather's legacy, and neither of those things were for sale. And I would offer Ryder a real position, not a gift, not a title, a job with hours and targets and accountability that he would have to actually show up for. My brother looked at me at that moment and said absolutely nothing, which for Ryder was a kind of growing up. My mother looked at the letter and the term sheet lying side by side on the table and said something, almost to herself, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it across the length of the room. She carries the name now. A year before she had told me Ryder carried the name and I just had it. Now she had watched her own father-in-law put in writing, in front of everyone, which child had actually earned it. She did not apologise. I want to be honest about that because this is the moment a softer story would give you a tearful reconciliation, and I think you deserve the true version instead. She saw the truth plainly for the first time. But seeing is not the same as changing, and she went home that day still married to the man who had shamed me, still the mother who had smiled into her wine. The difference was simply that she could no longer pretend she had not seen. I gathered the letter and the term sheet, slid them back into the envelope with Walter's handwriting on the front, thanked Marian for doing her job cleanly, and walked out of that conference room into the hallway and out the front door into the weather. The rain had stopped while I was not looking. The pavement was wet and shining under a thin, cold light. I got into my car and I did not drive home. I drove out Route 9 to the yard. I let myself in with the key he had pressed into my hand on his last good day, the one he had told me to use when the rain came through the roof. I stood inside in the smell of sawdust and cut pine and 50 years of honest work, In the building my grandfather had started with one truck in 1968 and trusted me to keep. The blue mug sat on the counter exactly where it always sat, where I had washed it and set it back the night after the funeral. I picked it up. I turned it in my hands for a long moment. Then I set it back down in its place. Because some things you do not move. You just keep showing up, and you keep the books clean, and you let the work speak in the language that cannot be argued with. The last of the rain dripped off the tin roof in a slow, steady rhythm, like a ledger finally balancing after a very long year. I had earned my own. He had seen me do it. And he had made it official the only way that lasts. In writing, with a witness, on paper that no one could take back.